Okay, can everybody hear me okay? All right, I want to welcome everybody this morning to the Provoking Attention Conference, which is going to run all day today and all day tomorrow here at the Kogut Center for the Humanities. My name is Amanda Anderson, and I'm the director of the Kogut Center, and I want especially to welcome all of our guests, several of whom came from the UK, and I understand are terribly jet-lagged. Part of the reason for this Anglo-American conjunction is that the idea for this conference grew out of a conversation I had with David Russell, my co-organizer, in Oxford in the fall of 2015. And he will be saying a few opening remarks as well after I'm finished. I'm not sure I can reconstruct how we came upon the concept of attention, but we were originally discussing British psychoanalysis, particularly British object relations theory, particularly Winnicott and Marion Milner, and we thought it would be interesting to have a conference or a symposium on this body of thought, which has been gaining increasing attention from scholars across a number of fields. We thought immediately of how great it would be if we could have Adam Phillips at such an event, and we are very pleased that that hope came to fruition. And then as we continued to discuss the idea, and partly prompted by the reach of Phillips' work, we came to the idea of expanding the topic to broadly engage in a rethinking of practice or method in criticism, psychology, sociology, aesthetics, and political theory. We became interested in what sorts of analysis the rubric of attention might produce, since it's also seen as a site of vulnerability in our current social and cultural world, at the same time that it's often given heightened emphasis and specification in discussions of method, where the object, aim, and the quality of attention are addressed, where a certain attentiveness, ethical and aesthetic, is sometimes emphasized, and where a certain political attention is often seen as ideally mobilized or provoked. This is emphatically not a conference about ADD or a lament about our 24/7 culture. I think we all have ADD, so I don't think we need to talk about that. But the backdrop of threatened attention, focus, and concentration does have some relevance to the forms and methods of the academy and of the humanities. Research takes time, and the forms of research associated with the humanities, in many cases better called inquiry or reflection or critique, are not particularly well suited either to outcome-driven models of the university or to producing an easily digestible takeaway or payoff. Tempo and time are also at play in many institutional and systems effects that we would do well to analyze and resist. Yves Sitton argues provocatively in his recent book, The Ecology of Attention, that attention is the crucial resource of our epoch, and that the current economic system is one in which the distribution of attention already plays a hegemonic role. He promotes an ecology of attention in place of the economy of attention, and it's our wager that many of the talks here will contribute to a rethinking of attention as a resource in our methods, in our practices, and in our politics, and across a number of fields in the humanities and the humanistic social sciences. A word about how things will proceed. In a word, conventionally. David and I thought a lot about whether we should shake things up and really light up the attention economy by either having speed papers or some other attention-provoking format. But we decided that we really liked the tempo of the two-person panel with a nice long Q&A, and we have for the most part held to that. We hope that conversation will develop over the course of the conference, and we will aim to keep to the time with minimum introductions and maximal time for intellectual exchange. Before I turn things over to David, I want to thank all of our out-of-town guests for making the trip to Providence for this event, especially during what I know was a somewhat challenging day of travel for many, and we still have a couple of participants on the way because of delays. And I would, of course, like to thank the staff of the Kogut Center, Trouda Kastner and Kit Salisbury and Melissa Shine, for all their help in putting on the conference. And I also want to thank the Heyman Center for the Humanities at Columbia for their contribution to the funding. So I'll turn things over to David.
Hello. Yes, I'm going to keep my remarks very brief, apart from to say everything Amanda said. I agree with that. But to say also a little bit more about the idea behind this event, one of the reasons that Amanda and I thought it would be such a rich subject is that, in a sense, attention, it couldn't be a more vital or important topic, but also you'd be hard-pressed to find a more vague one. And this is a provocation. And one thing we wanted to do was produce an event together, collaboratively, between the people who are invited to speak and also the audience who've come to participate, in which we just simply don't know what we're going to get at the end of it. That this is an experiment, and we encourage our speakers to be veer towards the experimental. We've gathered together, I think, an extraordinarily interesting group of people who have their own idioms, their own approaches to what is in fact a shared term, but a term that means different things to different people. And from that collision or collaboration, hopefully we'll get something new, just because it has to reach across different approaches. William James in 1890, in a lecture, announced, everybody knows what attention is, which is sort of true. I mean, it's one of those interesting terms, because everybody sort of thinks they know what it means, but the more you think about it, the harder it is to sort of pin it down. It's sort of one of those words that's very rich for ordinary language philosophy, or indeed what you might call ordinary language psychoanalysis, which is the psychoanalysis of people like Winnicott and Milner. William James also said the opposite of attention is distraction. This is one of the ways that he defines it in 1890. And then he doesn't really elaborate on what distraction is, apart from what he calls a sort of vague and scatterbrained state. That's distraction as the opposite, or maybe not an opposite of attention, is something that we may think about. He also points out slightly dismissively that the word distraction is French, as if that explains everything. He also says that attention, he says, implies withdrawal from some things in order to deal effectively with others. And there often is the implication of an economy at work, or that we're living in a situation where resources are scarce, or we really need to know urgently what should be attended to as opposed to other things. So the question of the narrowness or the capaciousness of attention is something that we may well think about. And then the other question of what kind of hope can we place in practices of attention? Is it something that can found an ethics? Is it a practice that can lead to, in a small way, starting small, lead to greater transformations of some kind, whether those are personal or societal? And this is one of the reasons we thought someone like Marion Milner was very interested, an interesting figure for us, because she really does start from the tiniest modes of narrow attention. But it does seem that attention is a catch-all term. It's a sort of site where potentially lots of different values or ways of approaching the world are in contact. And just to sort of wrap things up, I'll give you one example, which is something that I love. It's the beginning of Ben Lerner's novel, Leaving the Atocha Station, which is in 2011. And he describes his routine. The narrator, rather, describes a routine where he goes to the Prada Gallery every morning, and he stands in front of the same picture and pays attention to it, and he finds this deeply absorbing. And one day, this is his deep sort of sanity-securing routine, one day he gets there and there's another man standing in front of it, and he's really annoyed. And he wonders what this man's doing. And he's standing there for a long time, deeply staring into this image of the Madonna and Child. He stands there, and the narrator remarks, "The man broke suddenly into tears convulsively catching his breath. Was he, I wondered, just facing the wall, this painting, to hide his face as he dealt with whatever grief he'd brought into the museum? Or was he having a profound experience of art? And this question, what's he doing when he's crying in front of the painting, he then immediately thinks, this is a real problem for the security guards, right? Because this guy is behaving potentially like a mad person. Like, is he going to start attacking the painting? Should we be escorting him from the museum? Or actually, is art supposed to be making us break down in some way? And that's actually the whole point. And maybe we shouldn't be organizing our aesthetic world in ways that kind of gets people through as fast as possible with as much security as possible. So this question of what are we doing when we're paying attention, I hope if we don't get all the answers after the next 2 days, we'll have some. So our first panel will be Leo Bassani and Veena Das, moderated by Suzanne Stewart-Steinberg. So I'm going to pass things over to you.
So, good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to introduce the first two speakers on the first panel. Leo Bassani is Professor Emeritus of the University of California, Berkeley. Professor Bassani's had visiting professorships at the Collège de France, Harvard University, Princeton University, and the University of Pennsylvania. He is the author of The Freudian Body, Psychoanalysis and Art, The Culture of Redemption, Homos, Intimacies, which is in fact co-authored with Adam Phillips, is the Rectum Grave and other essays, and then most recently, Thoughts and Things. The title of his talk is The Choreographed Cure. Veena Das is Krieger Eisenhower Professor of Anthropology and Adjunct Professor of Humanities at Johns Hopkins University. Her most recent books are Affliction, Health, Disease, Poverty from 2015, Living and Dying in the Contemporary World, also from 15, The Ground Between Anthropologist-Engaged Philosophy, and then a co-authored book, 4 lectures on ethics. She's currently working on a manuscript entitled Textures of the Ordinary, Anthropological Essays, Wittgensteinian Traces, which is forthcoming next year. And her talk is entitled Creating and Dissolving, Attention, Stillness, and the Ephemeral and Ritual Life. So please welcome the first speakers. And in terms of choreography, I think the speakers will speak from the podium, and then we will go to the, sit as a panel after that. Thank you.
Jacques Lacan's relentless insistence on the primacy, even the finality of the signifier, gets a novel twist in this 1974 analytic encounter, remembered several years later by Suzanne Homel, a former patient who went on to become an eminent analyst herself. She tells Lacan a dream she has, un rêve que je fais, not un rêve que j'ai fait. This is a dream that she has had more than once. In doing this, she brings us, and presumably Lacan, to the threshold of therapy's exemplary model of interpretive material, one of the patient's dreams. But in the later account given during an interview with the analyst Gérard Miller, the dream itself is elided. The next sentence of Homel's memory brings us to the moment when dreaming stops, the moment of awakening. She tells Lacan that she habitually wakes up at 5 in the morning, and she herself immediately interprets this. It was at 5 a.m. that the Gestapo, during the occupation, came to arrest her Jewish neighbors. Lacan rises from his chair like an arrow, as Homel curiously puts it, as if propelled by an unthought need. He approaches her and, as you see, violating normal analytic protocol, touches her, stroking her cheek in what Homel remembers as an extremely tender caress. The material the analyst works with, Lacan tirelessly instructs us, is the signifier, the verbal chain through which the analysand is spoken and defined by the foundational structures of language. In the episode Lacan's former patient recounts, the analyst at once betrays and is wholly faithful to his doctrinal emphasis on the finality of the signifier. We note, first of all, that the signifying chain is enacted not by the analysand, but by the analyst, and it is enacted non-verbally. The object of attention is thus displaced from the analysand to the analyst. Nothing is heard. It is Lacan's moving body that is seen and felt, from his rapid rising from his chair to his approaching the patient and extending a hand to caress her cheek. And yet this silent trajectory makes no sense unless we appeal to verbal signifiers that Lacan's movements silently refer to. As if to ensure that we don't miss what Lacan is saying, Gérard Miller, out of the frame but essential to what is in it, in the sense that Suzanne Homel's narrative is being addressed to him, interrupts her account by explaining Lacan had transformed Gestapo into geste à peau, a gesture along the skin. Homel never reads the episode quite that way. It is the intrusively authoritative voice of the Lacanian organizer or director of the scene we are watching, who interprets not the analysand, but the master's treatment of the analysand. Homel's analysis has become the pretext for an interpretation not of her symptoms, but of Lacan's presumably therapeutic response to, I suppose, the symptom of her regularly waking up at precisely the hour when, several years earlier, she had been traumatized by the Nazis' arrest of her Jewish neighbors. What is the clinical value of Lacan's move, as well as of Miller's interpretation of them? The immediate effect of this brief account of a moment in Lacanian analysis is probably our bedazzled admiration of Lacan's linguistic cleverness. The repetition of Gestapo as geste à peau is an ingenious exploitation of the signifier's elasticity, its aptitude for superficial modifications. Here, the hard G of Gestapo becomes the soft, let's even say the tender G of geste. Slight shifts in positioning or pronunciation that are semantically charged. But again, what clinical value can this play with the signifier have? Homel's reading of her analyst is more subtle than that of her theoretically sophisticated third-party audience, the analyst Gérard Miller. Her voice, softer, more tentative than Miller's, sets things straight. Homel seems less impressed by the ingenuity of Gestapo becoming Gestapo than by the effect on her body, on her skin, of Lacan's acting out of the second pronunciation. She still feels that extremely tender touch, Homel tells us, as she raises a hand, as Lacan did, to her cheek. But that memorable gesture did not diminish the pain. Instead, it made it into something else. Homel, we might feel, is not very precise about the nature of that something else. She ends her account by referring to the caress as a call to humanity, or more exactly, like a call to humanity, comme un geste à l'humanité. Yes, she concludes, it was something like that. So it reached her face and has stayed there, while it also reached far beyond her as an address to all humanity, an at once modest and momentous gesture, with nothing we might call psychological about it. There is a persistent physical warmth and the sense of having been the vehicle for a moral interpellation to all men and women. What a strange analytic moment. Nothing has been analyzed. Nothing has changed in the analysan's suffering, in her pain, but something was added and remains, the sense of a physical warmth and tenderness as a call to humanity. All this is an interpretation not of the patient, but of the analyst, the object of attention here. An interpretation not of something he said, but of something his body did. The episode seems to have been immensely therapeutic without curing anything, and without modifying or adding anything to the analysan's knowledge of herself. Gestapo can never be forgotten, but it can be repeated with a difference. The difference depends on the repetition. Homel's 1974 analytic present is a reenactment, what I've called elsewhere a recategorization of the past. The traumatizing past has to be present for the patient as it was in order to disclose a virtual difference from itself, from within itself. In recategorized time, an ineradicable past is differently repeated, supplemented by a continuous future. In Intimacies, the book I co-authored with Adam Phillips, Phillips raises the possibility of analysis as no longer based on the prospect or the illusion of personal knowledge. Not only would the analyst fail to know the patient, self-knowledge might be irrelevant to, or perhaps only a minor part of the latter's analytic gain. Christopher Bollas has proposed a way of thinking about an analysis uninspired by epistemological ambitions. In Chapter 2 of his 1987 collection, The Shadow of the Object, Bollas speaks of what he calls an internalization of the mother's form, of what he calls her style of being, her aesthetic, that is prior to the internalization of her verbal messages. It is only in the second internalization that the child gets to know something about the mother, more specifically something about how she knows him or how she wants him to be knowable. In this later exchange, which depends on the baby's entering the structure of verbal language, the infant's being, as Bollas puts it, can be spoken or thought. Before that, the phenomenology of the mother's transformation of the infant's being is constituted, as Boles puts it, by the entirety of her way of being present with the baby. Boles specifies repeated gestures of care: feeding, diaper changing, soothing, crooning, holding, and playing. There is what he calls an idiom of care that gives form to the baby's internal world. What will later be spoken of as a child's character is based on his or her having internalized, as Boles puts it, the phenomenological reality of the maternal aesthetic. A certain style of being with, the manner of being, rather than the representations of the mind, is the pre-verbal version of dialogue. Boles writes, "We learn the grammar of our being before we grasp the rules of our language." To elaborate on Boles's distinctions, we might say that at the beginning we are choreographed into being. Individuality depends on self-fragmentations having been integrated through a processing form. What we learn to call works of art are not only a certain class of objects we will have to learn to approach and appreciate. They are diversified and elaborated models of the first work of art. They run parallel, so to speak, with the formalizations of a self. We move in the world as the product of what Boles strikingly calls a particular aesthetic of handling. The analyst must somehow repeat that processing of a human form, along with, more fundamental or foundational than anything he may learn about the analysand, he must replicate and therapeutically recategorize distinctive rhythms of being. Does it make any sense to call the analysand's psychic form a personality? What does Suzanne Homel learn about herself from Lacan's arrow-like movement, from sitting to standing to the extremely tender caress? Nothing. Lacan's little performance may have been one of the most important moments of her treatment, but it is not a moment as a result of the analyst's attention to the analysand's speech when something is uncovered, when something obscure in Homel's psychic map is healingly illuminated. And it's not as if something has come to light for the analyst, as if there had been some shifting elements in his knowledge of her, which his analytic technique may help her to share. Rather, there is a movement in which the coming to arrest the Jewish family is recast as the coming to caress a witness's cheek. Nothing profound is being revealed. If we stay within Lacan's conceptual scheme, we might say that the hard G of the signifier Gestapo has been metamorphosed into the soft G of geste. Gesture is not the signified of Gestapo. It is a virtuality within Gestapo that has moved to the position of being realized. Strangely, there is no psychological subject within the therapeutic move. What we generally think of as psychic content has, in this episode, the specificity of a corporeal rhythm. Our uniqueness, our individuality, is the form of how we have, over time, moved ourselves and how others have moved us through space. A personality is a specific aesthetic of handling space, the empty areas as well as those more or less congested places and moments where objects and living things facilitate or block our movements. Analysis in the psychoanalytic sense is the privileged theater where we, with the analyst, can witness the defining choreography of our being. Paradoxically, within that restricted space, the analyst, remaining, unlike Lacan with Homel, in his chair, rehearses with us revised reenactments of our original grammar of being. The corporeal rhythms I have referred to could also be reformulated as lines of force that are distinct from or to the side of the individual psychology that constitute what we call personality. The history of the modern novel could be seen as an evolution from the use of verbal gesture as expressive of individual psychology to the deployment of speech as psychologically undefinable lines of force. In D.H. Lawrence's Women in Love, for example, all the principal characters are lines of force. They differ from one another less on the basis of psychic inwardness than according to a kind of ethical hierarchy of propulsive energies. Lawrence places his characters on what we might think of as a scale of energy values, from Rupert's life-enhancing force to Lorca's present practice of an art destined to serve and promote the death-like principle of machine motion in modern industry. Rupert and Lorca occupy opposite ends of the scale. Everyone else is positioned according to their proximity to one or the other. We might schematize this life-death scale in the following way: Rupert, Ursula, Gerald, Gudrun, Hermione, Lorca. To focus our attention on the psychological interiority of these figures is to get lost in and irritated by Lawrence's incessant hyperbolizing of thought and feeling. What exactly is the difference between good and bad or life and death energies? The difference is perhaps most visible in the lines of force traced by bodily gestures. How does a gesture move in space? Or more specifically, how does it meet the obstacles it will inevitably, either intentionally or unintentionally, encounter? At one end of the spectrum of possibilities, we might place Lacan extending a hand to caress Suzanne Homel's cheek. In stark contrast to this is Hermione striking Rupert on the head with a paperweight made of jeweled stone. This murderous gesture can best be understood in strictly kinetic terms. We might, of course, mention this character's, Hermione's, insatiable passion for intellectual discussion, the ideas about education, equality, and knowledge that are her preferred instruments of social domination. But Hermione is much more, or more frighteningly, much less than that. Rupert cruelly reduces all her ideas to what he calls her bullying will. Will is a phenomenon of force that is only contingently human. It should be distinguished from aggressiveness, which, as Freud defines it in Civilization and Its Discontents, is inherently psychological. That is, it belongs to desire. Will, on the other hand, is not a desire. It is a thrusting through space inhabited by human and other living bodies, using those bodies as vehicles that can carry the impersonal intention of emptying space of all obstacles. Rupert is, as Lawrence precisely notes, the wall that inhibits Hermione's occupation of space. To be in the presence of someone who, like her, must pass through us, who must remove our obstructive otherness, is to feel what I will bizarrely call an ontological discomfort. The ultimate intention of will is to shatter us metaphysically. Lawrence appears to be evoking a metapsychic death drive. Ultimately, humans would be conveyor belts for lines of force that are intrinsically unrelated to their humanness, a humanness that has been superficially imposed on our pure materiality as an atomic being, a being made of accumulated atoms. Freud's obscure association of the death drive with the repetition compulsion is perhaps the closest he came to moving beyond the analysis of that drive in terms of a psychologically intelligible aggressiveness. In Lawrence's version of a death drive that we carry within neither our conscious nor our unconscious mind, but beyond mind, he tries to designate a drive that would carry us, would propel us unobstructed through space. In conclusion, we might ask if, during the past century or so, we have been in the midst of what Foucault would have called an epistemic shift. That is, a shift not so much in the objects of knowledge, but in the conditions of knowability. Conditions that may require shifting our attention from our hopelessly complex, muddled cartographies of desire to the continuously mobile diagrams of choreographed self-fashioning. Thank you.
First, I want to thank Amanda and David for this great invitation. And what a privilege to follow Professor Bersani and his both very elegant but also very, very provoking presentation in some ways. It's a great privilege because in some ways I'm going in a direction where what I present as concepts is somewhat prickly. And by that I mean that I'm going to be taking certain ways of thinking from Sanskrit texts. And I'm going to do it without apology, in the sense that very often there is I've myself found it very difficult to put these texts into some kind of relationship to both the way I do anthropology and the way I engage in philosophical discussions. And the reason is either that they begin to appear very exotic, although there is really nothing very exotic, I think, in the arguments that they're making, or it's seen as a distancing kind of gesture to, I've had very good friends who've said, this is not something, why are you putting these when you could put the same argument in terms of Wittgenstein or Cavell? And, obviously I'm very attracted to both sets of things. And so in some ways what I'm doing is a certain kind of experiment with saying, can I just make these concepts completely normal rather than something which, require constant explanations. So one of the puzzle that resonates across theories of language and ritual is that of the relation between dispersal and concentration. So in language, this comes up repeatedly in such questions as how do the meanings inhering in each word disappear when the sentence arises? That is what happens when you make a sentence. Does the meaning of the words continue in the sentence, or does it actually completely change? And this is an issue of such complexity that heads can be broken over it, so that there is a huge division between people who would say that the essential unity is the unity of the sentence, and those who would say that no, it's actually the words which are the carriers of meaning. But to give you one example of how something like this might be resolved, one is in aesthetic theory, the fundamental assumption that words crave the company of each other. So it's not really we who put words in relation to each other, it's that they couldn't exist without their craving the company in some ways of other words. And the second, that the process of transforming from words to making something like a sentence and giving it a unity, like in the Mimamsa, they would argue that just as when you are kneading clay for making a pot, there is a feeling of clayness. But when you make the pot, the feeling of clayness disappears and the feeling of potness, so to say, arises. So these are the sorts of questions really as to how do you move from one set of feelings to another set of feelings, which is not interior to the subject, but which is actually related to the particular way in which the world is engaged. In the second set of puzzles, which comes up in relationship to ritual action, but becomes part of the theory of action itself, is the puzzle that any action, for example, when you're performing a ritual, you might describe it as a sacrifice, but many kinds of actions that have to be performed are describable as discrete actions. You can say, I'm fetching water, I'm fetching fuel, I'm putting it on the fire, I'm cooking the rice, I'm now, preparing the animal for the sacrifice, I'm preparing the animal, washing it, cleaning it, I'm going to strike it. And the fact that if you think of this as sacrifice, the particular discrete actions will mean something very different than if you think of the action as cooking, for example. So these are the kinds of questions within which the issues of dispersal and concentration actually come to arise. And what is interesting is the resonance of these issues around language, these are issues around grammar, these are issues around ritual. And so I'm not positing a unity over here in terms of saying there is some kind of Indian tradition in which, which can oppose to modernity in any kind of way. I'm saying that what is interesting to me is the fact that the arguments that take place in the context in which what is said in language can be shown in dance, it can be shown in ritual, it can be shown in the manner in which it moves between everyday life and these kinds of contexts. So following from this, I think what is interesting is from many ethnographies have described this notion that the ritual performances in India have a center, but nobody's particularly bothered about the center. Like, if you go to a wedding, it's a huge problem to assemble everyone to actually watch the wedding because, everyone is kind of, drifting off to have conversations, eat food, go off, have tea. And really, the ritual theory is perfectly aware of the fact that attention will wander, even of the priest, who might actually forget to recite a very crucial verse, or might actually perform something with the wrong, with the wrong ritual implement. And this is why you actually get endless repetition, so that, the notion is the notion of basi, which just means the leftover from consumed food, but which is really over here the idea that everything leaves residues or gaps. And so, for example, after a full performance according to absolute ritual purity for, 5 hours, you might then the next morning insist on performing what's in Bengal called as Bashi Biye, which means the leftover wedding, which will be a repetition of the same wedding in a very diminutive kind of scale, right? So that we've assured that, that we've taken care of the fact that we may have been inattentive and missed something. Actually, this becomes, as law comes, this becomes a huge question as to whether or not this is really a marriage or not a marriage, because the priest forgot to perform such and such thing. So in some ways, the issue really of repetition and residue is seen also as something which spills over everyday life. So you could never get the kind of perfect illocutionary utterance as in Austen. You could never get an utterance which says, "Now I declare you man and wife," because of the fact that it is really very, very dispersed. And the fact that to actually become man and wife, a whole lot of other things would need to be done beyond the particular ritual that has been performed. This is a very interesting feature that I want to think in relationship to some of the earlier issues that I actually raised. So, for example, you could say that the ritual is over, but I've made a commitment. Many people in my fieldwork would do that, which is something like saying, after I lost my son, I knew that I still have to engage with the world, but I now engage with the world as knowing that everything can be lost in a minute, right? And so I may carry a small strip of a saffron cloth with me to remind myself that my engagement with the world is of this kind of nature. In mythology, this notion of dispersal comes up through the fact that a story can never have a single plot. That is, the author might imagine that he's going to write a story with a single plot. But every major poetic tradition will show you that within that plot, others will insert themselves. To give you one example, the whole story of the Mahabharata, this great epic, it can be described as a story of the war between the Pandavas, who are these 5 princes, and the Kauravas, their cousins, who are these, the 100 cousins. And the story is about injustice, and it's known as Dharma Yuddha, which is the righteous war. And the assumption is again that it's Draupadi, the princess, whose insult has had to be avenged more even than the loss of the land. But there's one very interesting framing aspect of this story, which is that Draupadi has many names, as every character in Indian fiction or poetry has. So one name is Draupadi, which means the princess, the daughter of Drupad. But another name is Yagyaseni, which means one born of the sacrifice. And the story is that between two great friends, a tremendous distance arises because one has become a king and the other is a poor Brahmin, and the king has insulted this poor Brahmin. And so the Brahmin now wants to create a son who will be so powerful and mighty that he will completely finish off the lineage of this, of this king. And so he performs what is famous, which is the performance of the snake sacrifice, which is instead of the pure ritual objects, what is sacrificed are the snakes, and all the snakes are sacrificed in the fire. And at the end of the sacrifices arises this powerful man who is, who's going to avenge. He comes out of the sacrificial pyre roaring that he is going to avenge the insult for his father. But unknown to everybody else and unseen by everybody else, when the fire cools down, they also see a little girl who has been also generated through the residues of the sacrifice. And this little girl is actually Draupadi, Yagyaseni, who has been put over there because the earth is completely tired of the war which is being constantly waged between the princely lineages. So you can then read the whole story as the story where the author is the earth, which wants really the end to warfare. And so, so for every story, you can actually see that through several kinds of devices. But the point is that you would never get a notion of a teleology, which is a secure teleology, to say this is where the story is actually headed. So from the mythical register, I go to the last register that I want to look at, which is a central category in Sanskrit grammar, which is the question of the importance of absence. It's very well known that Saussure's notion of zero significance is taken from Panini, in which it has had very, very elaborate construction. What is interesting is that in Paninian grammar, there are two terms, that of adarshan, which is literally not visible, but it could also be not audible, and lopa, which is disappearance. So Panini's defining sentences is adarshanaat lopa. Through the non-visual, we can get to that which has disappeared. I'm going to leave aside one puzzle here, which is that the adarshanaat is in the ablative case, which means in a way that disappearance is separating itself from this particular non-seeing. Because if non-seeing was the instrument of this disappearance, we would have had it in the instrumental case. I have no explanation or real understanding of the ablative case over here, but this is something I'm trying to work by thinking of other ablative cases. So I'm going to bracket that question for a moment as to why non-disappearance appears disappearance appears over here in relation to non-visuality, but non-visuality is seen something from which it will separate itself in order to be fully apprehended. The essential point that Panini is making is that lopa, or non-disappearance, is precisely the question of which kind of marks stay with the signifier as the word, and which kinds of marks completely disappear. That is to say, there are some words which will leave no mark whatsoever, but they will recall the grammatical operation. That is to say, with everything else, like a boy becoming from masculine to feminine, you have marks like ik, which is added as a affix to the word balak. So that's why it's become balika. Or from singular to the plural, you can have marks which will show. Or single to the dual, you will have marks which will show that. But there's some words which are very important in the sacrificial context, in which there must be complete disappearance of that word. And Panini's formulation is very interesting, because he's saying that these are the marks which are suspended between existence and non-existence. So it's not an opposition between existence and non-existence, but a suspension between existence and non-existence that he's actually most interested in. So the mode of absence in the world, quite interestingly, is not through the traces which remain and which can take us back to what has disappeared, but as a certain, and they're not in the consciousness of the subject, but they are there in the structure of the rules themselves. So there is a certain materiality, but that materiality is not visible to anybody. So non-perception, the second very interesting formulation that he has is to say that non-perception does not entail non-existence. Now here, because very little work has been done on the post-history of Panini, that is, we know a little bit about his commentators, but very few people have actually worked on what the commentators make of this. But I'll give you two examples. So Kasika gives synonyms. So adarshanam, non-seeing, he has a string of those, which also are anucharanam, anartharam, etc., which is not hearing, not pronouncing, annihilation of the sound. which are all extremely important, both in the, you hear the same word in some ways, but sometimes the word is something in which you can't see the mark. Other times you are not supposed to hear certain parts of the word. And thirdly, there are questions really of how you're not supposed to, you're supposed to completely annihilate the sound, which is very complex ritual procedures through which something like a sound, which you know exists in the world, has to be annihilated in that particular context and in that particular relationship. And the argument over here, Nagesh makes the point that these synonyms are important, and that we understand their importance because they're also present in everyday life, by which he means actually very simple rules, such as there are particular aspects of the sacrifice which the wife should not see, or there are particular ways in which within the sacrificial arena, within the ritual pronunciation of particular shlokas, you suddenly get a particular shloka which should not be pronounced loudly. You should be able to pronounce it to yourself, but you should not be able to pronounce it. These kinds of rules and regulations also formulate a certain aesthetic in a certain sense in which relationships are actually lived. They're not totally in the textbooks alone. So I'll give you three examples of this question of this notion of absence. The first, I work in, for the last 10 years, I've been working in areas, which you might designate as something like slums. And so these are not people who would be very learned in any of these texts. And yet it's quite amazing to me often, and I'm willing to make this as a strong claim, though it doesn't look like a strong claim right now, which is that you do see resonances of these ideas in the everyday life, among people, which is why it seems to me that they carry the kind of potency that they do. If these were purely in text which nobody had any use for, I think that they would not carry this kind of potency. So the first example I give you is of a woman who was very attached to the figure of the goddess. She had a small brass figure of the goddess, and that involves all these small rituals of, getting up, bathing the goddess, washing her clothes, making her wear these, decorating her, and so on. And a lot of the devotion is around precisely those sets of issues. So she worked with a guru because she wanted to become a healer. And the guru said she had to, from that goddess, he said she had to now begin to imagine the goddess as an internal object. That is, she had to imagine the goddess as someone who lived in her heart. And for that, she said that she had to do this meditation for nearly 2 years, in which she could think of, or she could create every feature of the goddess. That is, she could create the colorium in her eyes, the bindi, the dot on her head, the manner in which her eyes were curved, what clothes she wore, what diamond glistened in her nose, and so on. And she was greatly helped, of course, by the meditative practices of having 108 or 1008 names of the goddess, each of which gives this kind of characteristic. For example, I can say Krishna, I can say Krishna Nama, which is the dark one. I can say then Kumbhastapa, which is the one whose breasts overflow with milk, or or the one whose eyes are slightly curved eyes rather than just large eyes, and so on. And so she said after these 2 years, when she now felt that she had now freed herself from the goddess in her material form, for her to have become completely internalized, the guru then said, now you have to imagine that the goddess doesn't exist. And she said she nearly went mad in the process of imagining now that what does it mean for the goddess to not exist. So these are the sort of ways in which the question of attention is not only around creating, but also around dissolving. So how do you dissolve a relationship is as important in in the manner in which not only ritual practice helps you to say how a relationship can be or is dissolved, and a lot of these rituals I've written elsewhere of how they're experienced in an extremely cruel way. For example, death rituals will make you imagine the dead person in absolute great detail and then make you imagine that now this dead person has a ghostly existence and doesn't actually have, it has an existence, but it's a ghostly existence, till you can transcend to the idea that the dead person is completely dissolved. Last example that I want to give is that of, so here you would see, okay, I have two examples, but I'll just give the last one, which is what you might render as an end of an affair. But actually, the argument there was, I mean, for the woman, what brought about the end of an affair was the fact that the man ended up naming it. That is, as long as it was not named, so that you could continue to be in this relationship, but not have to name what this relationship is. It's the opposite, in a certain sense, to the idea that what would have sustained that relationship is to face the truth of that relationship. But what was involved over here was the question that whether all the gestures and the care that had become part of their relationship, now being named, actually became something else. And so I have a very detailed ethnography in some ways of how she lives this dissolution, trying to show how some of the ideas of what is absence in some ways, and the fact that something which is dispersed when brought into this concentration, so that the character of absence in a certain sense is something which becomes unbearable. The fact that it is significant or it is signification without a sign, when it gives way to the fact that it now has to have a sign and a particular presence in the world as that sign, becomes in a certain way the death of the relationship, and she has to now reimagine what it is to be living, as she said, that in some ways this is like going back to her existence as a stone-like existence, because she ceases to be addressed. I would, if in a longer paper, have given you another way of getting to this, which is primarily through not the rituals I described, but the rituals of Tantra, in which the basic issue, the basic grammatical question is the grammatical question of the first person, second person, and third person, and in which the person, even, so in Sanskrit, what is first person in English is what is third person in English is first person in Sanskrit. And so you get a very much more elaborate choreography of what is it to be the first person, second person, third person. And what I would have shown you in a longer thing, and I'm happy to answer any questions on that, is this entire notion of the fact that the person is insentient unless he or she is addressed. And the fact that this address disappears creates for this movement between between what she thought she was the second person, now she becomes a third person, one person among others, and the manner in which she actually uses that whole issue of what is it to be in a relationship where you are addressed versus what is it to be in a relationship in which you're just one person among others, and the movement in some ways of this totally object-like existence and becoming not a psychological subject, but becoming someone who can be diffused in the world through a certain apprehension of the importance of absence. Thank you.
So we have about 30 minutes time for discussion, and we'll take questions from the floor, but also if at any point the two of you would like to address each other, you should please do so. Amanda, you want to go first?
Yes, thank you for those two wonderful talks. Can everybody hear me? Do I need a mic?
Yeah, Amanda, yeah.
Thank you for those two wonderful talks. My question is for Leo Bersani, but I think toward the end of it, I will also kind of try to loop in a couple of things that Veena said and kind of hope that she also will weigh in on this. My central question is what the relationship between the aesthetic, the formal, the stylistics that you describe, and the ethical is in your conception of this particular therapeutic moment that you begin with. I was struck by your claim that what's being interpreted is the act of the analyst primarily. I think that's true to some extent, but I don't think that's the only thing that's happening there. I think also, obviously, that also the profound encounter matters enormously. And when you were describing the woman's own kind of comments about it or reflections about it, and particularly her appeal to humanity, I began to sort of wonder how you would read the moment of her being sort of more explicit, if not insisting on some, absolute, she says something like, but on her being sort of more explicit about a moral feature of the encounter versus what I took you to be valorizing as the kind of sheer formal quality of the Lacanian gesture. And that's just my main question, and I guess it has to do with, it's clear to me that you're refusing and wanting to move away from any notion of psychological interiority, but the question is, what is the ethical for you? I think you used the word moral once, the word ethical once, when you were talking about the propulsive forces, the hierarchy, the ethical hierarchy. What the force of the moral is for you in relation to the formal, I guess I would say. And the reason I think Veena might have something to say about this is that I felt that there were a few really interesting moments in your talk where you too wanted not to be alluding to a subject understood in terms of psychological interiority, but rather as a subject in relation to the world or in relation to others in the world. So that's a kind of a general parallel, but I'd be curious to know what you might have to say as well.
Yeah, I think everything I was saying about the ethical, the aesthetic, I find the microphone makes you incomprehensible, but it's sort of just tell me if you can. Yeah, I think everything I was saying about the aesthetic is, for me, to be talking about the ethical.
You have to use them.
Oh.
Sorry.
It's the acoustics in this room, yeah.
Okay. Anyway, everything I was saying about the aesthetic is for me to be speaking about the ethical. I think it's the ethical that needs some redefinition through which it could be incorporated into, I think the aesthetic ethical is a single category in a way. I think I have much more difficulty actually coordinating the ethical with the psychological in a way. I don't think there's anything ethical about psychology, but in some ways I think what is very amenable to ethical distinctions are kinetic and aesthetic distinctions and formal distinctions. In other words, I don't think there's a way of thinking about form. I remember got a lot of criticism about a book on Caravaggio that I wrote with Ulysse Dutoit, when everybody was saying, well, it's so formalistic, by which they meant that we were analyzing the paintings, which struck me as a peculiar objection. But I think the analysis of the paintings in analyzing the way in which the figures are relating, bodies are relating to one another, which is an ethical diagram, an aesthetic diagram, is also an ethical statement. I mean, what else is ethics except the ways in which we move in relation to one another? Movements which include verbal movements and bodily movements. So I think the distinction is somewhat, I think the distinction has been exaggerated and somewhat, and it becomes somewhat artificial between ethical and aesthetic. But
Yeah, that's an interesting question. You know, I take Wittgenstein's notion that that aesthetic and ethical are one, actually very seriously, because it doesn't seem to me that there is a domain of actions that I can say, these are the ethical actions and these are just the way I cook or, you know, eat or whatever. There is a sense in which the issue of how you are in the world is, is simultaneously aesthetic and ethical. And I know in anthropology this is, created a lot of angst to think that all our notions about moral will disappear if we can't separate out a domain that we can say is moral, and I think it's completely mistaken in some ways. That both the anxiety and that procedure to want to say, we can separate out and say these are the ethical statements because here is where the ought is, and so on and so forth. So my purpose in some ways is to show how the aesthetic and the ethical are actually completely molded into each other. And the second, yes, I do, if you mean by interiority something like a domain or a substance, I would of course say, that's a complete myth. But interiority in the sense of thinking that I do not need to gather evidence in order to prove to myself that I am in pain or that, or that I am, that I know this to be so, doesn't mean that there can't be any doubts or about, that the self is transparent. So I do think this question of in what sense the self is occult to oneself is a very important one. But I don't take that as a certain way in which I can get privileged access to something called interiority. And so one way that I tried to do that was through this first person, second person, third person, which is interesting that in most of the theories, such as Moran, for example, with very compelling notions about how every statement about myself is also a statement about the world. And I think he's true, he's right. But what happens there is the major contrast is between the first person and third person and the asymmetry there. But the second person completely disappears. And that seems to me a very odd way of thinking about relationality, because when the idea of what I'm saying, if I'm saying, like in this woman's case, when she's saying this to this man, it's something very different than if she were to say this in some ways as a general pronouncement about the nature of love or the nature of the world and so on. The thing that I'm myself quite divided about is the fact that there is such a, there is a certain sense in which to be in the world is also to be in the world in a certain mode of absence, right? And this comes very strongly also from the dangers that human beings pose to each other, the dangers that humans are to the world, and so on and so forth. And I don't quite know whether this means that there's no affirmation of life, or whether this means that we have to think about affirmation and negation in completely different ways.
So there are a bunch of questions. I think, Rigo, you were next, and then Michelle, did you have your hand up? And then Michelle next, and then Bonnie.
Bonnie?
Rigo.
Then maybe after me you can. Then. Okay. So I just wanted to put the two papers deep further into conversation with one another. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Better.
So I wanted to put the two papers further into conversation with one another and also just acknowledge a kind of stunning series of formulations that one of which was particularly striking to me, the Mahabharata, and I just wanted to flag that because in a way, maybe if one belongs, not because of Eurocentrism, but if you're from a different geography or history, you may not see how striking. It's like if someone offers a completely new reading of Oedipus, we would recognize it as something quite significant. But this idea that the earth is the author of the Mahabharata, firstly, I just wanted to acknowledge as something I'm quite stunned by and just wanted to confirm that it's your formulation and I hope you will continue it. But just to put the two papers more strongly in relation to each other, if one of the sort of framing issues is how does one think about attention in the absence of subject or a particular idea of subject or subjectivity that we may have and are trying to move away from, then one might say that it becomes a study of physics, not in the sense that scientists mean physics, but physics as a typology of forces. And what we're interested in then, as Professor Bersani is saying, is in a relationship and propulsion, activation, or through, say, certain, in a way, for me, the clearest inheritance is through Nietzsche and Deleuze. But I think the two papers do something quite remarkable together, and I was wondering, Professor Bersani, if you'll think about some of Wiener's formulations in the sense that if we think of where physics shades into or becomes metaphysics, or where physics, the study of forces, let's say. Yes, I am.
Because I can't understand what you're saying. You'd have to come up in front.
Okay.
You'd have to come up front. I can't
Okay.
understand what you're saying.
So, anyway, maybe Veena will relay my question to you if that's okay. So I'm saying that as you were urging us to think not about subjectivity, but about the play of forces. So let's say we call that physics. And then we ask the question that at what point does physics, or what are the problems that forces physics to grapple with metaphysics? And the problem, as Veena is saying, is of dissolution, or of how one would consider non-existence, or the dispersal or dissolution of existence, in the absence of a certain picture of subject, body, death, in which we come back to, in a way, very traditional theories of subjectivity. So I'm wondering if one can think further in relation to the two papers of what the attraction, repulsion of forces, etc. How would we think about where forces cease to exist, or what in a play of forces, how one would think about whether it's degrees of existence or non-existence, or thresholds into which something crosses over into something else. And usually we think of thresholds in relation to affirmation or in relation to creation. That is to say, a clay becomes a pot and pot becomes... But how do we think about degrees of non-existence, or the relation between what would be a typology of forces to a typology of something like dissolution is a really stunning question, I think, and would ask us to think about the relation between physics and metaphysics in a way. No, so maybe if you could...
I can
Yes,
respond.
so Veena can respond initially.
I can so Bhrigu, I think the opposition between saying that if you don't have, you're not positing a subject, then you are positing typology of forces. That I see as a problem, because what I understood from Professor Bersani's talk and from what I was trying to say is that something like the gestures that you are that he's sort of pointing out, it's not a question that here is a typology in which I can put these forces as belonging to life or to this threshold versus this threshold. The threshold notion is a very interesting one, but I'm very resistant to the idea that analysis means a certain kind of formation of typology. What could happen over here, because typology then assumes that fundamentally it's a certain sense of saying these are the sets and this is how you place these elements within these sets. Whereas my thought is that what you are having over here is the fact that the particular is itself conceptual. I don't know whether Professor Persani, the particular is itself conceptual. It doesn't need a further act into becoming part of a general proposition. In that sense, I think the idea of forces is interesting, but I would go in the direction of thinking further on the issue of how are concepts experiential rather than the processes of stripping them of the of the inessential in order to place them within a typologies. But I think it's a great question and needs, at least for me, needs more thinking too. Thank you.
So, we have a lot of questions, and I think it would be best if you could keep your questions short so that everybody get a chance. And the next person on the list is Michelle. Okay.
Thank you. I have a very specific question for Leo Bersani. If I understood you correctly, you said that in the analytic scene, nothing is heard, the scene that you described, nothing is heard, that there is a silent trajectory. You said in the psychoanalytic scene that you described that nothing is heard. There's a silent trajectory. And I'm confused about that. It's not clear to me how nothing could be heard and whether you mean nothing is spoken and whether that could really be silent, because when the hand arrives, it would be terrifying if there weren't sensory clues that it were coming. If there weren't sensory clues, be them visual or oral or otherwise. So I guess what I'm wondering is why you are invested in this being silent. Why is that important, and what does that mean?
I'm not invested in this being silent. I just think she's obviously speaking in talking about her waking up at 5 in the morning, but it wasn't something I fabricated. He didn't say anything. I mean, he just got up and moved around the desk and touched her. She had no reason to think it was going to be some violent kind of aggression. She didn't know what it might be. And when he did this, of course, there might have been a slight, recoil or surprise, but it was a silent incident, wasn't it? I mean, it didn't have to be, but it was. And I guess I insisted on it because we think of analysis as all talk. And this is interesting in the sense that it's something very important is accomplished without, after the patient stops speaking and without the analyst saying anything. So silence is important there, and just in the general in the context of my general points, it becomes important because it sort of isolates and emphasizes movement, which I was generally talking about anyway. That's all.
Okay, Bonnie, you're skipping? Okay, then I think, Tim, you're next in line.
Thank you. Veena, I really appreciated your analysis of the acentrality of the Indian wedding. I'm speaking as somebody who did, in fact, have an Indian wedding, and it was so incompetently, or rather distractingly, realized that it had to be, the leftover wedding had to happen in the United States to, in fact, make it official. But I wanted to ask you about, it's a question that's actually similar to Amanda's question of Leo Bersani. And it's related, I think, to some of the fascinating characteristics that you are, locating in a kind of ritual context. What happens when those characteristics are located and identified in an aesthetic context? I mean, my impression is that, but for both you and Bersani, I think it's another point of connection between you. Those categories of ethics, ritual, aesthetics are in a sense being perpetually decommissioned in relationship to each other. But for example, when you talk about Sanskrit, the use of the third person as a first person, this is a completely crude example. Obviously, that is something that we encounter aesthetically, in the novel, for example, repeatedly. So I guess I'm just sort of inviting you to maybe reflect a little more about what the implications of your fascinating analysis are for these large sort of global categories, ritual, aesthetics, and ethics.
That's a wonderful question, because in some ways it's all this, the Mimamsa from which I drew some of my examples, is simultaneously it is one of the philosophical systems, right? And what happens in the beginning when Radhakrishnan writes the 6 forms of Indian philosophy, schools of Indian philosophy, he says this is just mumbo jumbo, right? And actually, if you read it, sometimes it will appear like that. They spend hours saying if there are 10 animals to be anointed with butter and water, should you be anointing all of them first with butter and then with water, or should you be then saying butter, water, butter, water, butter, water? And you might say, why is this important? But of course, you look at the system and it's extremely important, because they are very concerned with the question of what makes a collectivity. Is it 1 + 1 + 1 + 1? Or is it all of them together? And a lot is at stake on how the ritual is performed, as to whether what is being offered is a collectivity or a collection of singularities, right? And so, of course, to me, it seems very interesting that what is a theory of language, it's about ontology, it is about questions really of what carries authority. They are the major proponents of saying that the fundamental unities only arises at the level of the sentence, etc., etc. All of which are recognized, as completely philosophical discussions. But there is a very long history. I could do you a history of the reception of the Gita when Hegel insists that it should be translatable in Latin, which Schlegel has already translated. It's retranslated in Latin for him, because first he's saying if it's not translatable in Latin, it can't be philosophy. Well, lo and behold, it is actually completely translatable in Latin and has already been translated in Greek and in Persian and so on, right? Then he spends a year and suspends his own work and actually spends a year trying to understand that, talks to William Jones, talks to Schlegel, and in the end says this is religion and not philosophy. So what you're asking is a very deep question. It requires a complete genealogy of why it is that the term ritual becomes so dissociated from the idea of philosophy. And the other is, of course, within anthropology, I've been critiqued so much now by people to say that I don't have any place for religion, because of the assumption that I don't equate religion with transcendence. Right? So that's the other way in which you say, oh, this is all about great spirituality, but what they are talking about is a certain kind of way in which they can think about the world, and that's the language that they have in some ways. So I really appreciate that question very much. Thank you.
So you have you're next. Yes.
Should I use mine or not?
Definitely.
Veena, move the mic a little closer, please. Veena, a little
Thank you.
closer.
Maybe I'll stand, make it easier to hear me, and to imitate Leo. I just wanted to ask maybe a somewhat simple question about the relationship between linguistic signification and bodily gesture, which seemed like one way to think about these two talks together. And I guess I'll just focus it by asking you a question, Leo, about, and I think it's related to Michelle's question about why is it important that this happen in silence. And I think I want to approach it from the other direction, which is to say, how much does it matter that this incident is interpreted after the fact through this linguistic moment of Gestapo translated into Gestapo. That's to say, since you're moving back through Bolas into a moment before the acquisition of language and thinking about, holding, right, a kind of choreography of handling and holding that doesn't necessarily involve language, how does this moment or this incident change if we don't filter it through or sort of contain? How do we approach it if we don't think of it in relationship to this play of the signifier that is the kind? Like, how would we interpret this moment, or how would we think about this moment of the gesture? Is it important to have is it important to see it through Lacan's play on Gestapo? Like, what if he just touches her face and that isn't actually, what if that kind of interpretation had never been made? Can we think about this apart from the realm of the signifier entirely? Because it's right, like, and we don't actually, that's speculative in a sense, right? Actually, it could have been completely in silence, and there's other ways to interpret it, just as holding, right, or just as gesture rather than as a play of the signifier. And does that matter?
The play with language is immensely important. This is getting to be a difficult play with language, but anyway. The play with language is, of course, terribly important, but it's interesting that everything depends on it, but at the same time that it's completely irrelevant to what's going on. I mean, it's sort of, no one says it in the analysis. It's something that they just figure out from what happens. So again, strangely, it's the analyst who's what's he doing? Actually, it would have been. I'm not sure, and this is sort of making a guess about things. I'm not sure that she, when he came around the table and did that she said, "Oh my God, he's interpreted Gestapo as Gestapo." She didn't have to. But if you go back and think about it verbally, then let's see. He stroked her cheek. Well, it was a gesture. Oh, guess. Then you sort of reconstruct it verbally. But I don't think that's necessary. Although it's so crucial in Lacan's talking about the fact that he works only with the signifier. But in fact, he could have gone through that whole thing, and it could have had the same. I don't think the immense effect it seems to have had on her doesn't have anything to do, with his play with language. It had to do with the fact that he walked over and caressed her. And that it could have been done with two other words. It could have been done with it was done with no words. And people came later and just sort of added to this, the 900 pages of écrit by saying, for page 901, we've got Gestapo to Gestapo. But it wasn't necessary. Like most language, it's
Okay, so I think you had a question in the back, right? Yeah. Microphone, please.
Hi, this is a question for Vina, and it's a question about. For Vina. Yeah, and it has to do with the wedding and side involvements. The wedding and side involvements, that is what Goffman would call side involvements, right? And what struck me is the vivid contrast between the scene of the wedding that you're describing in India and the one place where there cannot be side involvements in Goffman's sense, the kind of the talk on the side, the playing with the cats, the whatever it is, there are two places that I can think of immediately in any culture with which I'm familiar, and that is the wedding and the funeral, right? You're not as versus a wake or that, but just the wedding or the funeral stuff, that which is gathered under the rubric of a mass, right? Like that's one place where you can't talk. where you can't. And I'm just interested that in what's so at that moment, all of the ambivalence or all of the distraction that those of us who go to funerals and weddings here are obliged to suppress, right? That those are part of what sanctifies the scene rather than what would take away from it. Am I getting that right? Yeah. So, why is that? Is that what's? Can you say more about that? Is that or just repeating what you just said? Okay. That's fine. I just want to make sure I got that.
Actually, in the interest of time, can we take your question as well, and then maybe you can answer both together because we're running out of time.
All right. So my question is principally for Professor Bersani, and I'm thinking about.
Can you come closer?
Yes, I will. I'm thinking about the example of the gesture that you gave us, and it led me to think of what other gestures might we sort of contemplate. And so I have Proust on my mind a lot these days, and I know you know quite a lot about Proust. And I thought of two moments that are really choreographed, that are also somewhat ritual, have ritual moments, aspects to them. And this led me to, and I'll describe those in a moment, to think about whether in the moment of attention, if moments of interpretation are also just implicit, if they're really part of that same moment. And I'm thinking the first example in Proust is when the young narrator sees Gilberte Swann for the first time. And what's striking about this is that no words are spoken, but she makes a gesture, which the narrator interprets as an obscene gesture with her hand. No one knows what, there's been conversations about this, no one knows what that gesture was. 30 years and more than 2,000 pages later, he understands that it was not an insult, but in fact, an invitation. The other example I'm thinking of, another choreographed scene, no words are spoken, is when the narrator observes Charlus and Jupien in the courtyard of the Hôtel de Guermantes for the first time. And there is a kind of a ritualistic dance that takes place where, again, only interpretation would allow an understanding to take place. The narrator comments, I understood that Monsieur de Charlus was a woman, but we know later that that's not exactly correct. Okay, so I suppose in a way my question is, in a general sense, can we distinguish, attention and attention to gestures from their interpretation, especially when it's the case that there's no language, no spoken language?
I don't know. There are gestures that, I wasn't talking against interpretation of gestures. I mean, even if it were desirable, there's no way we could prevent interpretation of gestures. So, I'm not quite sure. I mean, it can be very useful to misinterpret a gesture. It sort of opens the gesture to virtualities that an accurate interpretation would have narrowed and limited. So I think a good, number one, the obvious answer is, as I said, a gesture invites, certainly in our culture, gestures invite interpretation. What was he doing? What was he thinking of doing at that moment? And I think it's very, Proust's the narrator's interpretation of Jupien and Charlus is extremely rich. And it really doesn't make any difference that he got their sexual roles sort of wrong, if that's what you were referring to, which I assume it was. That threw me off. But there's, I don't know, there are all sorts of, since I'm using choreography a lot, I think of ballet, which is obviously connected to choreography, and especially of Balanchine ballet, where for years it was said that these gestures, which do not include what you're used to in classical 19th century ballet, which is gestures that can be immediately interpreted, and there's so much mime, it's really too bad they don't speak, because it would have been much simpler and much clearer instead of all that stupid gesture and mime that they're doing, which is sort of, sort of the silly part of ballet. So Balanchine got rid of all that, and of course was treated immediately as not having any human interest, because there was no desire of being mimed in the thing. But when you see a pas de deux by Balanchine, which is all the way in which, and in Balanchine it's always a man and a woman, and the way in which the two bodies move toward, within, away from, is an extraordinary statement about possibilities of relating one body to another. And it doesn't make any difference whether you get it wrong or right. It still is opening you up to questions about gestures, which are more important than getting it right, I think.
Okay, so maybe the last word, Veena?
I think that was a great question about silence. What I might have made clearer, maybe, is the fact that one part of it is technical, which is when I said adarshana, that is non-vision. The use of the word in over there orients you to thinking that this is attached to the action and not to the, only 3 times I think in the text it gets attached to the actor, but not in his role as an actor. So because it is attached to the verb, and this is a very central feature of ritual theory, that what the instructions are on the performance of something, not who performs it, right? Although for the purpose of sacrifice, you will say this is intended for the sacrificer. But there's no, I can't think of any place where it is ever intended for a mass, right? So you never get a congregation around whom you could say this is something which, now you all must keep silent. This will not happen because of the fact that the recipient, the instruction is about the performance of the act. Yeah? So, Heidegger once, or is it Dastur's interpretation of Heidegger, where she says, what would have happened if we had actually a language in which the verb was primary and not the noun. So, if you take somebody like Russell, he'd say universals and particulars, you can divide according to what are nouns and what are adjectives. And in this whole system, it's the verbs which are absolutely central, and people are just attached in a certain sense to the particular action that has to be performed. So that gives it a very different orientation. But I think you're right to point out that that's really a difference worth examining more. I mean, obviously when the British confront India, and one of the things that really disturbs them is how noisy everything is. They keep passing legislation to restrict noise and so on. They just can't succeed in some ways. So there's something very interesting about, about this question. So one part of it is noise, and one part of it is speech and words. And silence itself is not just silence in the sense, that's what I tried to show, that there is the presence of the object in the mind, which is an essential formation of silence in some ways.
Thank you. And thank you to the panelists, and we'll take a quick break.